The morning Marigold Ashcroft set her pie basket down at the Red Ember Crossing market, three women turned their backs before she'd even opened her mouth. She was used to that. What she was not used to was the little girl sitting in the dirt beside a wagon wheel, hollow-eyed and so still she looked like something already half gone from the world. The child hadn't eaten in weeks. Her father was a man running out of time and options, and Marigold, mocked, widowed, worn down to the bone, was the last person anyone in that town would have chosen to save her. But sometimes the last person is the only one who can. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The pies were still warm when Marigold carried them to the market. That was the one thing she did right, according to herself, timing the walk so the crust stayed golden and the steam still lifted off the vents when she set them on the folding table. 23 minutes from her front door to the market square, and she had learned every variable. How fast to walk when the wind came from the north. How to hold the basket level on the uneven stretch past the miller's fence. How to keep the lattice tops from cracking when the autumn air ran cold and dry. She had done this enough times that her body knew the route better than her mind did. What her body had not learned, what she doubted it ever would, was how to stop noticing the way people looked at her. Or didn't look at her. Red Ember Crossing was not a large town. That was the particular cruelty of it. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name before you'd introduced yourself, where a stranger's arrival could be the talk of the feed store for a week. It sat at the western edge of the territory, wedged between the high grasslands and the first real climbing of the mountains, close enough to the timber camps that logging money moved through it, but small enough that the same 12 families still controlled what was acceptable and what wasn't. Marigold Ashcroft was not acceptable. She had been Marigold Thibodeau before the marriage, daughter of a flint-faced French-Canadian trapper who'd moved the family to the territory when she was 9 and died of a fever when she was 14. Her mother had followed 2 years later, leaving Marigold and her younger brother in the care of an aunt who made it clear they were a burden and a half. Marigold had married Thomas Ashcroft at 18, not out of love exactly, but out of the particular desperation that belongs to young women with no money and no prospects, and a brother who needed feeding. Thomas had been kind enough. That was the most honest thing she could say about him. He hadn't been cruel, hadn't drunk too much, had worked the small parcel they rented from the Hendricks family out past the creek without complaint. He'd also been fragile in a way neither of them had understood until it was too late, a weakness in his chest that the winter of their second year had found and exploited. He'd lasted through January, not through February. She'd been 4 months along when she buried him. The baby came in late spring. A boy. He lived for 11 days. Marigold did not speak of this to anyone in Red Ember Crossing, because Red Ember Crossing had learned about it the way frontier towns learned about everything, through other people's mouths, and the story that circulated had a particular shape to it that she could not correct because no one ever asked her directly. In the version that traveled from the butcher's wife to the preacher's sister to the women who ran the quilting circle, Marigold Ashcroft was a woman marked by misfortune in a way that suggested some deficiency of character, as if grief were catching, as if her losses were the kind that could spread. What she knew, and what nobody said plainly, but everyone seemed to believe, was that the body she carried told a story they decided they understood. She was heavy in the way of women who had endured hard things and found in food the only reliable comfort, not gluttonous, not lazy, but thick through the middle and the arms, broad-shouldered, slow-moving in a way that invited the particular cruelty of comparison to the frontier ideal of a woman, which was lean and capable and invisible in her laboring. Marigold was visible. She took up space, and in Red Ember Crossing, that was its own kind of offense. She set her pies on the table and smoothed the cloth underneath them. The market ran every Saturday in the square between the assay office and the hardware store. It was not much of a market, a dozen tables at best, some weeks fewer. Reuben Alcott sold dried goods. The Mercer sisters brought preserves. Old Dora Finch had the only decent vegetable plot in 20 miles and guarded her tomatoes with an intensity that other women reserved for children and silverware. It was a practical gathering more than a festive one, a place where people exchanged money for things they needed and exchanged information about things they didn't. Marigold's table sat at the end, near the corner where the breeze turned and the smells of the livery drifted through. She'd been given that spot 3 years running and had stopped asking whether she might move. The first hour went the way most hours went. A few people stopped, looked at the pies, kept moving. A man in a canvas coat bought a blueberry without meeting her eyes, put the coins on the table's edge rather than into her hand, and walked away. Two women from the quilting circle passed close enough to comment to each other, not quite loud enough for Marigold to catch the words, exactly loud enough that she caught the tone. She watched the square and pretended she wasn't watching. It was while she was doing this, looking without looking, watching nothing in particular, that she noticed the wagon parked at an angle near the hardware store, and the man crouched beside the left rear wheel and the child sitting in the dirt nearby. The man was big, not soft big, working big, the kind of large that came from years of actual physical labor rather than any vanity about it. He had a rancher's hands and a rancher's squint and dark hair that had been cut recently, but not carefully. He wore no hat, which was unusual, and he was crouched on his heels with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the child, and everything about the way he was holding himself said that he had been in this position, not the physical position, but the situation, for a very long time. The child was small, maybe 4, maybe 5. Marigold was not good at guessing ages of children. She had dark hair like her father, and a face that was pretty in the unfair way of small children, with large eyes and a sharp chin. She was dressed neatly, which meant someone had put thought into it, and she was sitting in the dirt in the way that children sit when they don't particularly care about their clothes, with her legs out in front of her and her back against the wagon wheel. She was not moving, not playing, not looking at anything. In her lap, untouched, sat a small tin plate with a piece of cornbread on it. The man, her father, clearly, was talking to her. Marigold was too far away to hear words, but she could see the shape of it, the careful, effortful quality of his voice. He reached forward and put his hand on the girl's knee. The girl didn't pull away, but she didn't respond either. She just sat there, looking at nothing, with the cornbread getting cold in her lap. Marigold looked away. Two women near Dora Finch's table were watching them too. One of them shook her head. "That's Rowan's girl," Marigold heard her say. "Poor little thing hasn't been right since her mother passed. 6 months now." "What does he expect?" the other said, not unkindly, but without particular compassion either. "Child's lost. Some children just—" She moved her hand in a way that completed the sentence without finishing it. Marigold turned back to her pies. She had 3 butter cookies on a small plate at the corner of her table. Not for sale, technically, just something she'd brought for herself and then not eaten because the walk had unsettled her stomach. They were shaped like stars because she'd used the cutter she'd bought for Thomas's first Christmas, before the money had gotten tight enough to change what Christmas meant. She still used it out of habit, or maybe out of something more stubborn than habit. She picked one up and looked at it. Then she looked at the little girl in the dirt, and the cold cornbread, and the father who had clearly been trying and failing at this particular battle for longer than she could imagine. She left her table. She walked across the square. She was aware of people watching. She was always aware of people watching. But this time she let herself not care about it, which was different from pretending not to care. The man looked up when she got close. He had gray eyes, which she hadn't expected, and a tiredness in them that was different from the ordinary tiredness of hard work. This was the other kind, the kind that came from worrying about something you couldn't fix. "She yours?" Marigold said. He looked at her like he wasn't sure whether she was about to cause him trouble. "Yes." "I'm not trying to interfere," Marigold said, which was not entirely true but seemed like the right thing to establish. "I just—" She looked at the girl. "What's her name?" "Elsie." Marigold crouched down. Not all the way. Her knees objected to that now, but enough to bring herself closer to the child's level. "Elsie," she said. Not a question, not a greeting exactly. Just the name, offered like you'd offer something to an animal that was skittish, something to let her hear a new voice before she had to decide what to do about it. The girl didn't look at her, but something in her face shifted, the smallest thing, barely visible. Marigold held out the cookie. She didn't say anything about it, didn't explain it, didn't pitch it, didn't make it an event. She just held it out, the way you'd hold out your open hand to a sparrow, patient, still, with no expectation attached. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Elsie Rowan looked at the cookie, and then she looked at Marigold's face. And then, very slowly, she reached out and took it. She took a bite. It was the smallest bite imaginable. barely enough to count. But she chewed it and swallowed it, and then she looked at the cookie in her hand like it had surprised her. Marigold didn't say anything. She didn't make a noise or a face or a gesture that would turn this into something that needed to be responded to. She just stayed where she was. Behind her, she could hear that the square had gotten quiet. The man, the father, let out a breath like he'd been holding it since spring. Hush. His name was Garrick Rowan, and he owned 340 acres northeast of Red Ember Crossing, with a cattle operation that had been his father's and before that his grandfather's. He explained this standing beside the wagon while Elsie ate the rest of the cookie in slow, careful bites, and Marigold pretended not to be monitoring every one of them. She stopped eating in April, he said. After Clara, after her mother died. At first the doctor said it was grief, that she'd come around, that children were resilient. He said the word like he'd heard it too many times from people who hadn't had to watch what he'd watched. But she didn't come around. She lost weight. Stopped talking, mostly. He stopped himself, pressed his mouth into a line. She used to sing, all the time, little songs she made up. She doesn't do that anymore. How long ago did she stop eating regular? 6 weeks. Maybe 7 now. He looked at his daughter. I've had the doctor out twice. He said if she keeps refusing food, we'll have to consider... He didn't finish that sentence either. I've tried everything. Everything she ever liked. Everything Clara used to make. I hired a woman from town to come out and cook for her, and Elsie wouldn't look at her. Who was the woman from town? Mrs. Pryor. Marigold made a sound. Garrick looked at her. What? Nothing. Harriet Pryor was not a gentle woman. She was efficient and clean, and moved through the world with the particular certainty of someone who had never seriously doubted herself. Children who were grieving needed something different from efficiency. What made you try her? She volunteered. He shrugged one shoulder. I don't know much about this. I know cattle, I know land, I know how to fix things that are broken in a physical way. He looked at Elsie again. The girl had finished the cookie and was still sitting in the same position, but there was a subtle difference in her face now. Not better exactly, just less far away. I don't know how to fix this. Marigold looked at him for a moment. He was not asking her for anything. That was not what this was. He was just a man who had run out of places to direct his worry and had landed temporarily on a stranger at a market who had done the one thing in recent memory that had penetrated whatever wall his daughter had built around herself. She liked the cookie, Marigold said. She didn't eat the cornbread. Oh, bows Marigold. The cornbread was cold by the time she got to it. She paused. And it wasn't made by someone who knows her. He looked at her. You don't know her either. No, Marigold said. But she doesn't know that yet. He came back the following Saturday with Elsie, which Marigold had not expected. She had told herself, walking home from the market the week before, that it had been a small thing, a one-time thing, a moment of luck that shouldn't be overinterpreted. She had told herself this with the same resolute insistence she applied to most of the good things that happened to her, which was the only way she had found to avoid being disappointed when they ended. But there was Garrick Rowan at 8 in the morning, standing at her table before she'd finished setting up, with Elsie holding his hand. You came back, Marigold said. We were in town anyway, he said, which was clearly not true given that the Rowan ranch was 20 miles in the other direction from anything anyone would need on a Saturday morning. Marigold looked at Elsie. The girl was watching her, actively watching her, which was different from the flat, absent stare she'd had last week. There was something working behind those eyes. Assessment, maybe? Or something more careful than that. I made more cookies, Marigold said. The same kind. Do you want one? Elsie nodded, just once, small. Marigold gave her one, and then she went back to arranging her pies because she had learned, from animals, from her brother when he was young and going through a dark season, from the few people in her life who had shown her the same, that the worst thing you could do with something fragile was look at it too directly. Garrick bought an apple pie and didn't haggle the price, which told her more about his character than most conversations would have. He came back the next Saturday, and the next. On the 4th Saturday, Elsie stood beside Marigold's table for nearly an hour, watching her wrap pies in cloth and make change and talk to the occasional customer. She didn't speak. But at the end of the hour, while Garrick was deep in a conversation with the hardware store owner across the square, Elsie pulled on the hem of Marigold's skirt. Marigold looked down. Elsie held up 3 fingers. 3? Marigold said. Elsie pointed at the cookies. You want 3? A nod. You're going to eat 3 cookies? Something that might have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't quite form, but the territory of it was there. All right, Marigold said, and put 3 cookies in a cloth and folded it over and handed it to her. But not all at once. Save some for later. Elsie held the cloth against her chest and walked back toward her father, and Marigold turned away before anyone could see whatever was happening to her face. It was Garrick who suggested she come to the ranch. He asked it carefully, like a man who had rehearsed the question enough times to know exactly how it might sound and was trying to steer around the worst of it. I know it's not a small thing to ask, he said, and I want to be clear about what I'm asking, just your time, and I'd pay you. For what? Marigold said. For whatever you're doing. He turned his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed he did when he was uncertain. She's eating again, but only a little. Only when she can look forward to... He stopped. When she knows she'll see you. Last week she asked me twice if we were going to the market. First time she's asked me about going somewhere in 7 months. Marigold looked out at the street. They were standing outside the dry goods store, where she'd run into him by accident, or what felt like accident, though she was beginning to think his appearances in town had a more deliberate pattern than he let on. You want me to come to the ranch, she said. Every day, if you could manage it. Morning to midday. I'd pay you fair, what a housekeeper makes, or better. I'm not a housekeeper. I know that. I didn't mean... He caught himself. I mean that I'd pay you what your time is worth, which I know is more than pie money. She looked at him. He held her gaze, which not everyone did. It's 20 miles, she said. I'll send a horse. I don't ride well. I'll send the wagon. She thought about it. She thought about her empty house, which had been empty for going on 3 years, and which she had furnished carefully and precisely, so that the emptiness had somewhere to live without overwhelming her. She thought about the small amount of money she made selling pies every Saturday, which covered what she needed but nothing else, which was another way of saying it covered survival but not life. She thought about Elsie Rowan's face when she'd asked for 3 cookies, the first time in God knows how long that child had asked for anything. 2 weeks, Marigold said. I'll come for 2 weeks and see if it helps. Something moved through his face. Not quite relief. It was more complicated than that. 2 weeks, he agreed. The ranch was not what she'd expected, and she'd tried not to expect anything. It was large, larger than any property she'd lived on or near, and had the bones of something that had once been well-maintained and had since slipped into a functional disorder. The main house was 2 stories, wood-framed with a porch that ran the full front length and needed repainting. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her where Garrick Rowan's priorities were instinctively directed. There was a kitchen garden that had been ambitious once. She could see the ghost of its design in the arrangement of the beds, but had been reduced to a few scraggly rows of something she couldn't identify from the wagon seat. What she noticed most was the quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The other kind. A hand named Denny helped her down from the wagon, a lean older man with a sun-scoured face who nodded at her without comment and led the horse away without lingering. There were 2 other hands she saw at various distances during that first morning, both of whom treated her with a neutral courtesy that felt studied. They were being careful, she realized, watching to see what she was. Garrick met her at the porch steps. He looked like he'd been up since before light, which she suspected was always. Elsie's inside, he said. She's been up since 5 waiting. She knows I'm coming? I told her yesterday. She didn't sleep. Marigold felt the weight of that. Inside, the house had the particular quality of a space where someone had made efforts and then stopped making them. Things were clean, but not cared for, functional, but not warm. The kitchen was large and would have been good if it had been used, but she could see from the state of it that it had become mainly a place where canned goods were opened and eaten without ceremony. Elsie was sitting at the kitchen table. She was wearing a blue dress that was slightly too big for her, which meant it had been purchased for growth or had been something her mother chose. She had her hands folded on the table in front of her with a formality that would have been funny in a child that age if it hadn't been so heartbreaking. She was watching the door. When Marigold walked in, Elsie's face did something complicated, relief mixed with a wariness that was already old in such a young face, like she'd been burned by hope before and wasn't sure she could afford it again. "Hello," Marigold said. "I brought flour. I thought we might make bread today, if you wanted." Elsie looked at the bag in her arms. "What kind?" It was the first full sentence she'd heard from the girl. 4 words, and her voice was quieter than expected, with a roughness in it that might have been disuse or might have been the residue of crying. "The regular kind," Marigold said. "But I could show you how to do it so the crust comes out right. Do you know how bread rises?" A small shake of her head. "It's not complicated, but it takes patience." She set the flour on the table. "Do you have patience?" Elsie considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Sometimes," she said. "That's enough," Marigold told her. "Okam." She did not know how to explain, in later years when she thought back on those first weeks, what exactly she did that was different from what anyone else might have done. The honest answer was probably not much. She didn't have special knowledge. She hadn't trained for anything. She made bread and biscuits and soup and sat at the kitchen table while Elsie watched her and gradually watched her less warily. She sang while she worked, old songs mostly, ones her mother had sung that had no particular meaning except that they occupied the mouth and filled the quiet. She didn't ask Elsie to eat. She just cooked, put food on the table, said nothing about whether it was eaten or not, and moved on. The first time Elsie picked up a spoon and ate half a bowl of vegetable soup without being asked, Marigold was washing dishes with her back turned. She heard it. She didn't turn around. The first time Elsie spoke an unprompted sentence, not answering a question but offering something, it was to say that her mother had kept the flour in a tin with a blue lid, not a bag. "So bugs couldn't get in," she said. "Mama was very particular about bugs." Marigold nodded. "Smart woman," she said, and made a note to find a tin with a lid. The second week, Elsie started helping. It started as watching, standing close enough to see what Marigold's hands were doing, tracking the movements without commentary. Then it became something more. A small hand reaching in to hold the bowl steady, while Marigold kneaded, or fingers helping to press the cutter into the rolled dough. She never asked to help. She just inserted herself at the edges, and Marigold accepted this without making anything of it. The crying started in the 3rd week. It happened in the kitchen, over nothing that Marigold could identify as a specific cause. One moment Elsie was pressing stars out of cookie dough. They'd kept the star cutter, and then she was not. And the sounds she made were the kinds of sounds that meant they had been accumulating for a very long time. Marigold dried her hands. She sat down beside her. She did not put her arm around her immediately because she didn't know yet whether that was something Elsie would accept. And she had found in her life that the wrong kind of comfort could sometimes close a person off from the right kind. She waited, and when Elsie leaned into her on her own, she put her arm around her and let her cry. She said nothing except, eventually, "I know," which was not a perfect thing to say, but it was true, and it was short, and sometimes truth and brevity were enough. Garrick watched all of this from various distances. He was not a subtle man. She could see him watching, could see him deliberately giving them space, and then being unable to stop himself from checking, but he was a respectful one, which she had not fully anticipated. He didn't interfere in the kitchen. He didn't ask her for reports on Elsie's progress the way a man managing a situation might. He asked once, simply, "Is she better?" And when Marigold said, "She's moving toward it," he nodded and didn't push. He ate her cooking without comment for the first week. The second week, he said, "This is better than anything I've made or had made in this house in a long time," and then looked uncomfortable about having said it, like he'd given too much away. "When did you last have a full meal?" she asked. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "A real meal. Sat down, took your time." He thought about it. "Before Clara got sick," he said. "So maybe 8 months." "You've been eating standing up for 8 months?" "Eating when I remember to." She didn't say anything about that, but the next morning she made sure there was food on the table at noon, and she sat down and ate it, and indicated without words that this was the arrangement now. He sat down. He ate. He didn't say much, but then neither did she, and the silence was the kind that had room in it rather than the suffocating kind. By the end of the second week, when she should have been preparing to tell him she couldn't continue, she found herself unable to construct a reason that she believed. 2 more weeks, she said. He said, "All right." like he had been waiting for that. The gossip started on her third visit to town. She'd gone with Garrick on a supply run, which she had told herself was purely practical. She needed specific things from the dry goods store that couldn't wait until Saturday, and had not let herself examine too closely. They were not together. Not exactly. They were two people who happened to be in town at the same time for overlapping reasons, walking on the same street. That was, apparently, enough. She heard it from Dora Finch, who was one of the few people in Red Ember Crossing who spoke to her plainly, mostly because Dora was too old to bother with social architecture and too sharp to pretend she didn't see things. "People are talking about you being out at the Rowan place," Dora said, weighing out a pound of cornmeal with the precision of someone who had been cheated by small measures enough times to distrust every scale. "I know," Marigold said. "They're not saying kind things. I know that too." Dora looked at her over the scale. "It bother you?" Marigold thought about Elsie's face last Tuesday when she'd finally sung something, a scrap of melody, barely audible, while she was arranging biscuits on a pan, just 3 or 4 notes. She'd caught herself and gone quiet, looking guilty, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed. Marigold had said nothing, just gone back to what she was doing. 2 hours later, the singing had come back. Longer this time. "Less than it used to," Marigold said. Dora made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. "You be careful," she said. "Not of him, of the rest of them." Marigold picked up her cornmeal. "I've been careful my whole life," she said. "It hasn't kept much out." She was out the door before she had to see Dora's expression, which she suspected would have been something she'd think about too long afterward. The day the 2 weeks turned into a month, and the month was turning toward 2, Garrick found her on the porch in the early evening when she should have been heading home. She'd stayed later than usual because Elsie had wanted to finish a batch of ginger cookies, and there was something about the light in the kitchen and the sound of the girl humming to herself, really humming, a real song this time, something with a structure to it, that had made Marigold unable to make herself leave. "You don't have to go tonight," Garrick said. She looked at him. "I have to go home." "I know." He leaned against the porch rail. "I just meant you could stay for supper first. It's late to be driving back." "Denny said he'd take me." "Denny's been up since 4 in the morning." She was quiet. "I'm not trying to—" He stopped. Started again. "I want you to know that what you've done for her, what you're doing, I don't have words for it that are adequate." She sang this morning, in her bedroom, not because she thought anyone was listening. She just sang. His voice did something at the end of that sentence that he seemed to notice and correct. "She hasn't done that since before her mother went to the hospital." Marigold looked out at the land. The light was going pink and low over the grass, and the mountains to the west were collecting shadow. It was not an unbeautiful place. "She's doing it herself," Marigold said. I'm not disappearing. That's the main thing I'm doing, not disappearing." He looked at her. Something in the way he looked at her made her want to look away, and she didn't. "Stay for supper," he said. "I'll take you back myself." She stayed. The supper she stayed for was not a comfortable meal, and she would not pretend otherwise, even to herself. Garrick cooked it, or attempted to, and what he produced was technically edible in the way that things made by people who have stopped caring about eating tend to be. A pan of salt pork fried too long, and some boiled potatoes that had gone soft and waterlogged. And a loaf of bread she'd made 2 days ago that was starting to go dry at the edges. He set it on the table like a man apologizing without words, and she sat down and ate it without comment, because it wasn't the food that mattered. Elsie ate with them. That was the thing that mattered. She sat at the table in her chair, her specific chair, the one she'd apparently claimed years before her mother got sick and had refused to sit in since, until 3 days ago. And she ate a full plate. Not everything on it, but more than she had in months, according to what Garrick told her later, standing outside while Denny brought the wagon around. "She asked if you were coming back tomorrow," he said. "I'll be here." She asked what time. Marigold thought about her mornings, the walk to the market on Saturdays, and the rest of the week the quiet house, the pies she baked on Tuesday and Thursday for the few standing orders she had from the hotel kitchen and the assay office. The garden that was more weeds than anything now. The way the light came into the kitchen at 7 in the morning, and she had no particular reason to get up before it. 8, she said. I can be here by 8. He nodded. I'll send Denny for you at 7. She climbed into the wagon and did not look back at the house because she was afraid of what she'd feel if she did, and she had a careful relationship with her own feelings that required her to manage the exposure. But on the ride back, in the dark with the grassland running flat and quiet on either side of the track, she let herself think about Elsie's face at supper. The way she'd asked for more bread, not by asking, but by holding out her plate in a way that was almost shy about it, like she wasn't sure yet that the answer would be yes. And Marigold had put another slice on her plate, and the girl had said thank you in a voice that was only just audible, and that had been the whole of it. And it had been enough. It was more than enough. It was, she thought in the dark, rattling homeward in Denny's wagon, more than she'd had in a long time of anything that mattered. She told herself to be careful about that. She told herself this with some regularity over the following weeks, as the arrangement became a routine, and the routine became something that felt dangerously like a life. She arrived at 7:30 most mornings, because Denny was an early riser, and the drive took less time than estimated. Garrick was always already up and usually already outside, and they would exchange a few words about what she needed from the kitchen or what Elsie's night had been like, and then he would go back to work and she would go inside and begin. She started with bread because bread required the most time, and she had learned that the smell of it baking, that particular warm yeast and flour smell that she associated in some deep part of herself with safety, had a measurable effect on Elsie's mornings. The girl would appear in the kitchen within 20 minutes every time, as reliably as anything Marigold had observed in nature. She would stand in the doorway first. This was a consistent habit that Marigold had come to understand as Elsie's way of assessing whether the morning was safe before committing to it. Marigold never rushed her out of the doorway, never said good morning in a way that required response. She just went about what she was doing, and Elsie would stand there as long as she needed to, and eventually she would come in and sit down, and the morning would begin. The talking came gradually, the way warmth comes back to cold hands, not all at once but in slow degrees, the feeling returning before the function does. Elsie talked first about small things, the chickens, who she had opinions about and named with a specificity that told Marigold these were long-standing relationships. The one with the broken feather on her right wing was Mabel. The one who wouldn't stay in the yard was called Trouble. The small brown one who followed Elsie's boots around was Pearl. Pearl is the best one, Elsie said one morning, watching Marigold core apples for a pie. Why is she the best? She doesn't pretend. Elsie picked up an apple core and looked at it. Some of the others act nice when you have feed. Pearl acts the same all the time. Marigold looked at her. She was not sure whether a 5-year-old had intended the philosophy in that, or whether she was reading it in because she needed to, but either way it landed. That's a good quality, she said. Mama liked Pearl too, Elsie said. It was the first time she'd mentioned her mother in Marigold's presence without it being in the past tense, like something she was testing, to see whether saying it would break something. What else did your mama like? Elsie thought about it with the same gravity she brought to most questions. Lavender. She put it in the pillowcases. Papa said it made him sneeze, but he didn't really mind. A pause. She liked when it rained. She'd sit on the porch and watch it. She said rain was the world cleaning itself. Another pause. I used to sit with her. We'd count the lightning. Do you still go out when it rains? No, flatly. Then after a moment, it doesn't feel right without her. Marigold nodded. That makes sense, she said. And then she asked, because it seemed important to ask, do you think it will always feel that way? Elsie thought about it for a long time, long enough that Marigold finished coring the apples and started rolling the crust before the answer came. I don't know, Elsie said. Maybe it'll just feel different. Not right, but different from how it feels now. Yeah, Marigold said. That's probably closer to how it works. It was one of the more honest conversations she'd had with another person in 3 years, and she was having it with a 5-year-old over apple cores on a Tuesday morning. She thought about Thomas, the way she sometimes did when the thinking was useful rather than just painful. She thought about the particular wrongness of those first months after he died, the way ordinary things had become strange. Eating, sleeping, walking to the market. The sky was the wrong color. The air had a quality she couldn't name. It wasn't grief exactly. She hadn't loved him deeply enough for devastation. It was more like disorientation. The removal of a structure she hadn't known she was building her days around. And then the baby, which was a different thing entirely. Not disorientation, dissolution. She had not spoken of either of these things to Garrick or to Elsie or to anyone in Red Ember Crossing because she had learned that people's capacity for someone else's grief was limited in ways they didn't always advertise. And she had been caught before by her own need and had not liked how it felt to be caught. But she thought about it while she rolled crusts and braided bread and watched Elsie Rowan slowly, imperfectly, unevenly come back to life. She thought about it in the way you think about things that still matter, carefully, from a deliberate distance. The ranch began to change too, though she had not meant for that to happen. It started because she couldn't look at the kitchen garden without her hands wanting to do something about it. She asked Garrick if she could have a corner of it for herbs, practical ones, for cooking, not decoration, and he said yes before she'd finished the sentence. So she put in thyme and sage and flat-leaf parsley and a few rows of onions because onions were the foundation of everything she cooked, and the ones available at the dry goods store were often half-rotted. Within a week, she had expanded to a second corner because the soil was better than she'd expected, and she had ideas about what could happen in it. Garrick noticed on a Thursday. He'd come around the side of the house to find her on her knees in the dirt, which was not a dignified position, and she'd looked up expecting him to say something about it being more than she'd been asked to do. Instead, he looked at the bed and said, "That's already more than Clara managed to get going in 3 years." "The bed was laid out well," Marigold said. "Whoever designed it knew what they were doing. That was her." He looked at the garden for a moment. She kept trying. The altitude made it difficult. "It's not the altitude. It's the soil composition. It needs amendment." She sat back on her heels. "Would you mind if I worked on it?" "When Elsie doesn't need me." "Do whatever you want with it," he said. And then, like he'd said too much again, "I mean, it would be useful for the kitchen." "That's why I'm doing it," she said, which was mostly true. Elsie started coming out to the garden too. This surprised Marigold because she had not invited her. She'd been careful, with everything, not to create expectations or obligations that the girl hadn't chosen for herself. But one morning she looked up from transplanting seedlings, and Elsie was standing at the garden's edge watching her, wearing her blue dress and her small boots with the left sole starting to peel, holding Pearl the chicken against her chest with the authority of a girl who had decided the chicken needed to observe this too. "What are you planting?" Elsie said. "Carrots, but they won't be ready for weeks." "What else?" "Come look." Elsie came and she crouched beside Marigold and they went through the beds together, and Marigold named things and explained what they were for, and Elsie listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything, completely, without distraction, like each thing was worth the whole of her interest. Pearl the chicken wandered between them and ate things she wasn't supposed to eat, and Elsie scolded her in a voice that was trying to be stern and wasn't, and it was ordinary. Completely, unexpectedly ordinary in a way that felt, to Marigold, like breathing after holding her breath for a long time. She realized on the drive home that evening that she had laughed that afternoon. Twice. Not politely, but actually. Once when Pearl pulled a full seedling out of the dirt and ran with it, and once at something Elsie said about Mabel the chicken's personality, which was apparently very bad. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that. The memory of it scared her a little. The gossip from town had not quieted. She knew this not because she went looking for it, but because she went to town twice a week for supplies and the market on Saturdays, and Red Ember Crossing was not large enough for information to stay in one place. She heard things at the edges of conversations, in pauses that were slightly too long, in the way certain women stopped talking when she walked past, and then started again just before she was out of earshot. She heard her name attached to descriptions she would not have chosen. She heard Garrick Rowan's name said in a way that implied a character flaw in him for employing her, a pity he couldn't do better, a suspicion about what her actual function at the ranch was. She had heard things like this before. She had a system for it. Locate the part of yourself that is solid. Stand in it. Keep moving. What she had not anticipated was how much harder it was to locate that solid part when there was something to lose. Before the ranch, before LC, her life had been something she could hold together with both hands and defend because it was already so small and compressed that there was very little for cruelty to find purchase on. She had her house, her pies, her Saturdays at the market, which she endured. She did not have much, which meant there was not much to take. Now, she had a kitchen that smelled like bread in the mornings. She had a child who came to her doorway and stood in it, working up her courage for the day. She had the satisfaction, quiet, complicated, real, of watching Garrick Rowan sit down to a full meal and look for a few minutes like a man who was not in the act of surviving. These were not small things, and that meant they were things that could be taken. She kept this fear in a specific, contained place and did not take it out where anyone could see it. What she showed instead was steadiness, reliability, the quality of a woman who showed up because she said she would and did the thing and left when it was time and came back the next morning without drama. She was not sure how long she could maintain this, but she kept showing up. The morning that changed the shape of things was a Thursday in what might have been the 6th or 7th week. She had stopped counting exactly, which itself told her something she tried not to look at. She arrived at the ranch to find Garrick not in the fields as usual, but sitting on the porch steps, which was where he sat when something had gone wrong. She got down from the wagon and thanked Denny and walked up the path and said, "What happened?" "Elsie had a bad night," he said. "Nightmare. She was up from 2 in the morning. She fell asleep maybe an hour ago." "Is she all right?" "She was asking for you." He said it without any particular inflection, like a man reporting facts. "In the night, she kept saying your name." Marigold sat down on the step beside him. Not because she'd planned to, it just happened. She set her basket down between them and looked out at the yard, at the early light coming long and flat across the grass, and said nothing. "I didn't know what to do," Garrick said. "I sat with her. I sang her something, but I can't carry a tune and I don't know the words to anything she likes." He looked at his hands. "I said your name back to her. I said, 'She'll be here in the morning.' And she said, 'How do you know?' And I said, 'Because she always is.'" A pause. "And then she went back to sleep." Marigold was quiet for a moment. "That was the right thing to say," she said. "It was the true thing." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to put something on you with this. I wanted you to know what you are to her." She looked at the land. She thought about what she was to Elsie. And she thought about what Elsie was to her, which was a thing she'd been carefully not thinking about. A child who held 3 cookies against her chest like something precious. A child who said rain was the world cleaning itself, that her mama had said that. A child who was singing again in the mornings. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. And then, because he needed more than that, "I mean it, I'm not going anywhere." He nodded. They sat on the porch steps in the early light and didn't say much else, and there was something in the not saying that was its own kind of honest. When Elsie woke up at 9:30, puffy-faced and embarrassed about it, in the way children get embarrassed about showing fear, she came downstairs to find Marigold at the kitchen table with 2 cups of warm milk and a plate of the star-shaped butter cookies. Not a whole batch, just 6. Just enough. Elsie sat down across from her and drank her milk and ate 3 cookies and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I dreamed you left." "I know," Marigold said, "but you didn't." "No." Elsie looked at her over the rim of her cup. "Are you going to?" Marigold looked back at her. She thought about honesty and what it owed a child. She thought about the gossip in town and the fear she kept in its contained place and the solid part of herself she stood in when the world tried to move her out of it. "Not if I can help it," she said. It wasn't a promise exactly, but Elsie nodded like it was enough and reached for a 4th cookie, and outside the kitchen window the morning light was moving warm and yellow across the kitchen garden, across the thyme and the parsley, and the careful rows of carrots that wouldn't be ready for weeks. And the ranch was quieter than it used to be, but differently quiet now. Not the dead quiet of a house where someone is gone, but the quieter of a place that was still learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to hold itself together again. By the time supper came, Elsie was helping Marigold shape biscuits and talking about Pearl's most recent crimes against the garden with the kind of indignation that was really affection. And Garrick came in from the fields with mud on his boots and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the 2 of them and looked at the table set for 3 and didn't say anything, just went to clean up. But Marigold had seen his face in that moment before he turned away. She told herself to be careful. She told herself this while she set the biscuits in the oven, and while she heard Garrick's boots on the stairs, and while Elsie started humming something at the counter beside her. But careful had never been the same as safe, and she was beginning to wonder if she had confused the 2 for too long. The carrots came up in late October, which Marigold had not expected because the first frost usually hit the northeast range before the root vegetables had time to finish. But the kitchen garden had been amended well by then. She'd worked compost into the beds through September, turned the soil twice, covered the rows with straw when the night started dropping. And the carrots came up orange and firm and slightly crooked, the way carrots grown in real dirt always are. Nothing like the straight uniform things sold at the dry goods store that had clearly been grown somewhere warmer and more forgiving. Elsie pulled the first one herself. She'd been watching the bed for 2 weeks, checking every morning with a patience that surprised Marigold, who had expected a 5-year-old to lose interest in the abstraction of underground vegetables somewhere around week 3. But Elsie had not lost interest. She'd watered the bed carefully, in the precise way Marigold had shown her, and she'd kept Pearl away from it with a vigilance that was almost military. And when Marigold crouched down on that Tuesday morning and pressed the soil around one of the thicker stalks and said, "I think these are ready," Elsie had gone still with the particular stillness of someone trying not to hope too much. She pulled it herself, both hands tugging with more effort than was strictly necessary because the ground was still a little firm from the night's cold. The carrot came free with a small pop and a spray of dirt, and Elsie looked at it in her hands with an expression that Marigold recognized and had to look away from for a moment. "It's real," Elsie said. "Of course it's real. What did you think it was going to be?" "I don't know, She turned it over. It had a split tail, 2 legs going different directions. "It's funny looking." "It grew however it needed to grow," Marigold said. "That doesn't make it wrong." Elsie looked at her when she said that briefly, with something in her face that was not about carrots. They ate them at lunch, sliced thin and roasted with the sage from the herb bed and a little butter. And Garrick ate his without comment, but then ate a second helping, which was its own kind of comment. After the meal, while Marigold was clearing the table, he said, "That was the garden?" "Elsie's carrots," Marigold said. He looked at his daughter. "Good work." Elsie stood a little straighter and did not try to hide that she was pleased. She was getting better at not hiding things. This was, in Marigold's private assessment, the most significant sign of recovery. Not the eating, not the talking, but the willingness to be seen wanting something and to let yourself be glad when you got it. It was that same week that the women from town came. Marigold heard the wagon before she saw it. 2 horses, moving faster than the road from town really warranted, and something in the sound of it made her straighten up from the kitchen counter and go to the window. 3 women in the wagon, and a 4th she didn't immediately recognize sitting in the back. She knew 2 of them from sight, Vera Hollins, whose husband ran the bank and who had twice managed to be in the same aisle of the dry goods store as Marigold without acknowledging her existence, and Patrice Drummond, who organized the quilting circle and had a voice that carried farther than she seemed to realize or care. The 3rd was Harriet Pryor. Marigold set down the dish towel she was holding. She looked around the kitchen. Elsie was in the garden with Pearl, which she was grateful for, and she went to the front door and opened it before they'd reached the porch steps. This was a deliberate choice. She had found in her experience of unpleasant encounters that waiting to be knocked upon gave the knockers a particular psychological advantage. Opening the door first was not a power exactly, but it changed the shape of things. "Mrs. Hollins," she said. "Mrs. Drummond. Mrs. Pryor." She didn't know the 4th woman well enough to name her, so she nodded in her direction in a way that was neither warm nor hostile. Vera Hollins was the one who stepped forward. She was a slender woman in her early 50s with a careful face, the kind of face that had learned long ago to reveal nothing that hadn't been rehearsed. She wore a good wool coat and carried herself with the assurance of someone who had never seriously been told no by anyone whose opinion she valued. "We've come to speak with you about a matter of some concern," she said. "All right," Marigold said. She did not move aside to invite them in. She stood in the doorway and waited. Vera's eyes moved briefly to the interior of the house and back to Marigold's face. A small recalibration. "We thought you might invite us in." "I don't know yet whether this is an inside conversation," Marigold said. "Go ahead." Something tightened in Vera's expression. She was not accustomed to this, Marigold could see. She was accustomed to a particular kind of deference, especially from women in Marigold's position, and its absence required adjustment. "We're here because we're concerned," Vera began, "about Mr. Rowan's reputation and about the welfare of his daughter. A man in his position, a widower with a young child, cannot afford to have his household arrangements the subject of speculation. And I'm afraid that's exactly what's been happening. What kind of speculation? Marigold said. Patrice Drummond, who had clearly been restraining herself with some effort. People are talking about you being here day after day. Everyone knows you're not. She stopped herself from finishing that sentence, but the ending was clear enough. Everyone knows you're not the kind of woman who should be in this house. I cook for them, Marigold said. I help with Elsie. That's what a housekeeper does, Harriet Pryor said from behind the other two. She said it in the particular tone of someone who has been waiting to say something and has finally found the opening. A housekeeper with a proper arrangement, known to the community, vouched for. Not, she paused, not an informal situation that gives people room to talk. Marigold looked at her. You were here for 2 weeks in August, she said. Elsie wouldn't eat for you. Children can be difficult when they're grieving. That doesn't mean she hadn't eaten more than a few bites in 6 weeks before I came, Marigold said. She's eating 3 full meals a day now. She's talking. She's singing. She kept her voice level, not because she wasn't angry, but because anger in this particular kind of encounter had a way of becoming the story. That's not a reputation problem. That's a child recovering. We're not questioning whether you've been helpful, Vera said, taking back the conversation from Harriet with the practiced ease of someone who runs meetings. We're saying that the way this has been conducted has exposed Mr. Rowan to a kind of talk that does him no favors. And you as well, frankly. She said that last word with the specific inflection of a woman who has no intention of being frank but wants credit for it. You cannot benefit from this kind of association either. Marigold looked at her. She thought about what she wanted to say and what she would say, which were 2 different things. I appreciate your concern, she said. I'll let Mr. Rowan know you came. We'd like to speak with Mr. Rowan directly, Patrice said. He's in the North Field. He'll be back at midday. She looked at all of them, each face in turn. You're welcome to wait. They did not want to wait. She could see that. They had rehearsed an encounter that included her being smaller about it, easier to move, and her refusal to accommodate that was already costing them the shape of the thing. Perhaps you might consider, Vera said, making one more attempt, whether your presence here is ultimately doing what you think it's doing for the girl, or whether it's simply comfortable. For you, that landed. She would not pretend it didn't. It was a precise thing, targeted with the accuracy of a woman who understood how to find the undefended places in a person, and it found one. Because the honest answer was that yes, it was comfortable. That was the problem. That was exactly the problem. Before she could construct a response that was measured enough, she heard footsteps behind her. Elsie was in the hallway. She had come in through the back, which meant she'd been in the garden and had heard some portion of this, how much Marigold couldn't know, and now she was standing in the hall with dirt on her boots and the carrot she'd apparently just pulled from the ground still in her hand and her face in an expression Marigold had not seen on her before. It was not the blank absence of those early weeks. It was not the cautious, watchful look of a child deciding whether something was safe. It was something much harder and much older than 5 years should have been carrying, and it was directed at the women on the porch. Elsie, Marigold said quietly. I heard, Elsie said. Not to her, to the women. Vera looked at the child with the complicated expression of a woman who had children of her own, and was not entirely immune to them, but who had come here for a purpose and intended to maintain it. Elsie, honey. Don't, Elsie said. Don't call me that. Vera stopped. You came here to make her leave. Elsie took a step forward. She was not a large child, and her boots were dirty, and she was holding a crooked garden carrot in both hands, and there was absolutely no question that she meant every word she was about to say. I know what you said. I know what people in town say about her. Elsie, Marigold said again, you don't have to. I want to. She looked at Marigold for just a moment, and something in that look said, let me do this. Then she looked back at the women. Before she came here, I didn't eat. I didn't talk. I didn't want anything. Her voice was steady in a way that was clearly costing her. My papa tried. He tried everything. He didn't know how to help me, and I didn't know how to tell him what I needed. I didn't know what I needed. A breath. And then she gave me a cookie. She didn't make me take it. She didn't make me do anything. She was there. Every day. And she didn't leave. She stopped. Her hands were tight around the carrot. She gave me back. She seemed to be searching for the word. She gave me back the part of me that wanted to be here. And you want to take her away because of what people are saying. Her voice went sharp on the last word. People say things about her at the market, too. I've heard them. They said them when I was standing right there. She looked at Vera Hollins. Your friend, Mrs. Alcott. She said things last Saturday while I was standing right next to the table. Did she know I was there? Did it matter? Vera Hollins had the grace, or the awareness, to look down. She saved my life, Elsie said. That's what I know. And I don't care what anyone says. The silence that followed was a particular kind, the kind that can't be filled adequately by anything that comes after it. Patrice Drummond looked away. The fourth woman, the one Marigold didn't know, had gone very still. Harriet Pryor had her mouth pressed into a line and was not quite meeting anyone's eyes. Vera Hollins looked at Marigold. Her expression had changed, not entirely, and not into anything that was going to resolve easily, but something had shifted in it. We weren't trying to... She stopped, reconsidered. We came with good intentions. I know, Marigold said. It was the most generous thing she could offer, and she offered it plainly, without the rest of what she felt about it. She heard a horse before she heard him. Garrick came around the side of the house on foot, which meant he'd left the horse at the fence and walked, which meant he'd come faster than he'd normally come and had made decisions on the way. He had mud on his jacket, and his face was not angry, exactly. Resolved in a way that looked like anger but was colder than that. He looked at the women on his porch. He looked at Marigold. He looked at Elsie, who was still holding her carrot with both hands and standing straight, and something moved through his face that he controlled before it became visible. Ladies, he said. His voice was even. I didn't know we had company. Mr. Rowan, Vera began, we came because we were concerned about... I heard most of it, he said, from the fence. He looked at Vera Hollins with the directness of a man who didn't owe her the particular diplomacies of a social inferior. I appreciate that you came. I want to be straightforward with you about something, though. He stepped up onto the porch. He did not do it aggressively, did not position himself as a barrier exactly, but he was there, between the women and the door, between the women and Marigold, not in a dramatic way, but in a factual one. What Marigold has done for my daughter and for this household is not something that needs defending, he said. Not to this town, not to you, not to anyone. What my household looks like is my business, and I am telling you that it looks exactly like it should. He paused. The talk in town? I can't stop that, I know that. But I'm asking you directly to consider whether it's worth continuing. Garrick, Vera said, and her voice had softened in a way that probably worked on other people. We're thinking of your future. You're going to want to remarry someday, the right kind of woman, someone the community can... I'd like you to leave now, he said. Not loudly, not with the specific heat of a man losing his temper, just clearly, in a voice that left no interpretable space. Vera Hollins looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Elsie, then briefly at Marigold, and that look was more complicated than the others, less certain of itself. We'll see ourselves out, she said. The wagon left in less time than it had arrived, and the sound of it faded across the grass, and the three of them stood on the porch, Garrick, Marigold, Elsie, in the quiet that came after. Elsie was the first one to move. She walked over and pressed herself against her father's side, and he put his hand on her head automatically, the way parents do. He looked at Marigold over his daughter's head. I'm sorry, he said. You didn't do anything. They came here because of me, because of my situation. He kept his hand on Elsie's head. That's not fair to you. Marigold leaned against the porch rail and looked out at the land, the carrot beds in the garden, the mountains in the distance, slate-colored now in the afternoon light. Elsie did more than you, she said. Or me. I meant it, Elsie said into her father's jacket. Everything I said. I know you did, Marigold told her. She meant to leave that evening with the thing handled, the porch conversation closed, herself intact and organized and unaffected in the ways that mattered. She meant to sit in Denny's wagon on the way home and think practically about what today meant for the arrangement and whether anything needed to change and how she would manage whatever came next from the town. She was good at this, the practical forward-looking management of difficult things. It was one of the skills that surviving required. What she had not managed, in all her practicality, was the part of herself that had stood in that doorway while a 5-year-old child defended her with a crooked carrot in her hands and said she had given her back the desire to be here, and had felt, without warning, without time to prepare, the full weight of being seen. Not politely seen, not seen with the qualified regard of someone who was tolerating her, seen completely by a child who had no reason to dissemble about it and every reason to be honest. She cried in the wagon on the way home, quietly, so Denny wouldn't hear over the noise of the wheels, and she was not sure whether she was crying because of what Elsie had said or because of what she was already beginning to understand about what she was going to have to do. Because the women from town would come back, or others like them would. She knew this about communities. She had grown up watching how they worked, how they decided who was acceptable and who was a problem and what happened to the problems. And she knew, with a clarity that was not comfortable, that she was a problem in Red Ember Crossing in ways that had nothing to do with Garrick Rowan or the ranch. She had been a problem before she ever stepped foot on his land. This was simply the current address of a difficulty that would follow her. And that meant that staying, however much she wanted to, however much she had let herself want to, was not a simple thing. Staying had costs. Not to her. She had already paid most of the costs that a woman in her position could pay. She had paid them and survived them, and she could pay them again. The costs were to Elsie, to a child who had already lost her mother and who had already today demonstrated a courage that her small body barely contained. A child who should not have to spend her growing years being the occasion for her father's social difficulties. A child who deserved better than the kind of love that brought trouble with it. She thought about this for the 20 miles home. She thought about it while she made her own supper, which felt sparse and quiet after the Rowan table, and while she sat in her own kitchen in her own empty house and told herself, with careful deliberateness, that this was what she had. This was her life. She had built it on something real, her own hands, her own work, her own stubborn refusal to be smaller than she was. She did not need what was at the Rowan Ranch to be whole. She believed this. She had believed it for 3 years, and it had been true enough to live on. But she sat in her kitchen for a long time that night before she went to bed, and in the morning she was at the ranch by 7:30, because Denny was early and she had not come up with a good enough reason not to be. What she didn't know, and what she would not know until much later, was that even as she was telling herself she could manage this, that she could hold the thing at arm's length, keep it from becoming what it was already becoming, Garrick Rowan was sitting in his own kitchen in the hour before dawn, thinking about something Elsie had said before he put her to bed. She'd looked up at him while he was tucking in her blankets and said, in the direct way she'd been getting back, "She's scared." He'd said, "What makes you think that?" "Because she looks like me," Elsie said. "Before, when I was scared someone would leave." She settled back against her pillow. "I think she's scared she's going to have to be the one who goes." He'd sat with that through the night, turning it over. By the time Marigold arrived in the morning and came into the kitchen and put the flour down on the table and said good morning to Elsie, who was already in her chair, Garrick was standing in the doorway with a look on his face that she couldn't fully read but that she filed away, the way she had gotten into the habit of filing things about him, carefully, without knowing yet what she was saving them for. She left on a Wednesday. She had not planned it for Wednesday specifically. She had not planned it at all, in the sense of sitting down and making a decision with a clear beginning and a clear end. It had accumulated instead, the way certain kinds of pain accumulate, slowly, below the threshold of notice, until one morning you wake up and the weight of it has become too specific to ignore. What happened on Tuesday was this. She had gone to the dry goods store in the afternoon while Denny waited with the wagon, intending to pick up salt in a bolt of the cotton batting she used to line her pie baskets in cold weather. She had been in the store for less than 5 minutes when she heard her name from the back aisle, spoken by someone who either didn't know she was there or didn't care. "Ashcroft woman, yes, I heard she's practically living out there now." A second voice, lower, "What does Rowan think he's doing? His wife barely cold and he's got that—" She didn't hear the rest because she had already set the salt on the counter and walked out. But she didn't need to hear the rest. She had heard versions of it enough times to know how sentences like that ended. She paid for the salt and the batting. She said nothing to the store owner who rang her up with the careful neutrality of a man who had heard what she'd heard and was choosing not to acknowledge it. She climbed back into the wagon and told Denny she was ready. On the ride back to the ranch, she thought about Elsie. She thought about what it would look like. In 5 years. In 10. A child raised at the edge of a community's contempt. The girl whose father kept company with the widow everyone mocked. She thought about the market on Saturdays and Mrs. Alcott saying things in earshot of a 5-year-old and the particular cruelty of a small town's long memory. Red Ember Crossing would not forget. That was the thing about places like this. They forgave the people they had decided to forgive, and they kept accounts on everyone else. And the accounts followed children. She did not want Elsie to carry her. It was that simple and that terrible. She stayed through supper that Tuesday. She cooked, and they ate, and Elsie told a long, complicated story about Pearl's latest altercation with one of the other chickens that involved enough dramatic reconstruction that Garrick's mouth kept pulling to the side in the way she had learned meant he was trying not to smile. She watched them, father and daughter, this imperfect and slowly mending thing between them. And she told herself she was doing the right thing. And she told herself this so many times and with such deliberate force that by the time Denny drove her home, she almost believed it. She was packed before midnight. Not much. She lived lightly, which was another skill that surviving had given her. She wrote a note and rewrote it twice, because the first version said too much, and the second said too little, and the third said only, "I'm sorry. This is better for both of you. I hope you understand someday." She folded it and put it in the pie basket she would not be returning because she could not walk up to that door in the morning. She knew herself well enough to know she couldn't do it in person. She arranged with her neighbor's husband, who owed her a favor and asked no questions, to drive her to the Mercer station before light. She did not look back at her house when she left it. She had looked back at too many things in her life and had found the practice did not serve her. What she had not accounted for was that there are only so many places a woman alone can go in that part of the territory without money and without connections, and she had neither in useful quantity. The boarding house in Millhaven was her destination, 2 towns east, far enough to be a different life, close enough that the travel wouldn't take everything she had. She'd heard from Dora Finch once that a woman there took in boarders and didn't ask about circumstances, which was the main qualification. She made it to the Mercer station. She made it onto the eastbound coach. She sat with her basket in her lap and watched the grassland move past the window in the gray pre-dawn light and told herself it was the right thing so many more times that the words lost their meaning entirely. She was 3 miles outside Red Ember Crossing when she started crying and could not stop. Not elegant crying. The other kind. The kind that comes up without asking permission and makes your whole face ugly and doesn't care. She pressed her hand over her mouth because there was another woman on the coach across from her who was already looking uncertain about the situation, and she breathed through it and told herself she was fine. She had survived worse than this. She had buried a husband and a child, and she had stood in her own kitchen afterward and made pies and walked 23 minutes to the market and held herself together with both hands, and she could do it again. She could always do it again. That was the thing she had never decided whether to be proud of. She was at the Millhaven boarding house for 4 days before Garrick found her. She knew it was him before she heard his voice, because she heard the boots on the boarding house stairs. A particular kind of step, weighted and deliberate, the walk of a man covering distance with intention rather than speed. And something in her chest recognized it before her mind caught up. She was sitting in the small room she'd rented, which had a window that looked at the side of the building next door, and a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a bed with a quilt that smelled like someone else's life. She heard him knock on the landlady's door downstairs, heard his voice, not the words, and then heard the landlady's, and then the stairs. She sat very still. He knocked on her door. "Marigold?" She said nothing. "I know you're in there. Mrs. Ferris said you went up 20 minutes ago." A pause. "I'm not leaving." She believed him. That was the difficulty. "How did you find me?" "Dora Finch." Of course, Dora had known. She'd sent Marigold a look at the market 2 weeks back that had contained an entire conversation that neither of them had chosen to have out loud, and apparently Dora had filed it away for exactly this purpose. "Garrick," she said, "go home." "No. Elsie is with the Alcotts." A beat. "She hasn't eaten since she found your note. She stopped talking again yesterday morning." His voice was even, but she could hear what the evenness was costing. I'm not saying that I'm not weaponizing it. I'm telling you because it's true, and because you deserve to know what's happening." Marigold closed her eyes. "Can I come in?" he said. She got up. She unlocked the door. He looked like he'd been writing hard and sleeping less. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the particular kind of tired in his eyes that was not the usual tired from work, but the other kind, the one she recognized. He had his hat in his hand and his jacket was dusty from the road, and he stood in her doorway for a moment, just looking at her with an expression that was more complicated than she knew what to do with. "You didn't say goodbye," he said. "I couldn't. I know." He didn't move into the room. He stayed in the doorway, hat in hand, like a man observing a boundary he wasn't sure he had the right to cross. "Can I say something?" "I'm not going to stop you." "I rehearsed this," he said. "I had the whole thing figured out on the ride here. What I was going to say, how I was going to say it so it came out right." He looked at his hat. "I've lost it." Despite everything, something shifted in her chest. "Just say it plain," she said. He looked up at her. "I love you." She opened her mouth. "Don't!" He held up his hand. "Let me finish, please." He took one step into the room, just one, stopping there. "I'm not saying it because you helped Elsie. I know that's what you'll think, that I'm grateful and I've confused gratitude for something else. I thought about that on the ride here. I thought about whether I was sure." He set his hat on the washstand. "I'm sure. It's not gratitude. Gratitude doesn't keep a man up at night the way this does. Gratitude doesn't make him go over everything a person said in a day, looking for the parts he didn't appreciate enough when they were happening." He paused. "That's something else." She sat down on the bed because her legs were not being cooperative. "I know who you are," he said. "I know you're not. I know the town doesn't see you the way I see you. I know what people say. I heard some of it before the women came to the house, and I heard more of it after. And I want you to understand that not one word of it changes what I know about who you are." He looked at her steadily. "You walked into a square full of people who had decided you were something small, and you put a cookie in front of my daughter, and you waited. You waited, Marigold, without asking for anything back. That's not a small person. That is not someone who needs to disappear for the sake of other people's comfort." She looked at the cracked pitcher on the washstand. She looked at the window that faced the other building's wall. She had been looking at walls a long time. "It's not about what I'm worth," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she'd intended. "I know what I'm worth. I worked that out a long time ago." She looked at him. "It's about what it costs Elsie to have me there. It's about a little girl growing up with a community's grudge following her around because of me. I won't do that to her." "You're not doing anything to her. You're the reason she's herself again." He moved closer, not dramatically, just closing the space that had been between them in a way that felt like the end of a long circumnavigation. "I talked to her before I left. I told her where I was going. I told her I was going to ask you to come home." He stopped. "She said to tell you something." Marigold looked at him. "She said—" He stopped. Seemed to be working to keep his voice even. "She said to tell you that she knows you're scared. She said she knows because she felt the same way. She said she spent a long time being afraid to want things because she thought wanting things meant losing them." He paused. "She's 5 years old and she said that. And then she said, if you don't come back, could you at least write to her? Because she'd like to keep learning things." Something broke open in Marigold's chest in a way that she recognized as the specific pain of love. Not romantic love, not parental love, but the broader, more dangerous kind that doesn't discriminate. She had been trying for months to keep that particular door closed, and it had been open the whole time. "She said that," Marigold said, "word for word, except she also said please, which I almost forgot." His mouth pulled at the corner. "She's more polite than me." Marigold looked at her hands. She thought about the boarding house room and the wall outside the window, and the 4 days she had spent in here telling herself she had made the right decision. She thought about what the right decision was actually supposed to feel like, which she had assumed was peaceful and which had felt, so far, like suffocation. "The town isn't going to change," she said. "Not quickly." "No," he agreed. "People will keep talking." "Yes, and you want me to come back anyway." "I want you to come back," he said. "Not as the woman I hired, not as Elsie's, not as whatever category is easier for people to accept. I want you to come back as the woman I'm asking to build something with." He picked his hat up from the washstand and held it again, turning it in the way she knew he did when he was uncertain, and she found she was not able to look away from it. I'm not good at this. I wasn't good at it with Clara either. I'm a man who knows cattle and land, and I don't have the words most of the time for the things that matter most. But I know what I'm asking. I know what it means. She was quiet for a long time. The thing about fear, she had learned, was that it was not always a warning. Sometimes it was just weather, something that moved through and made you cold and kept you indoors and then passed, leaving the same ground underneath that had been there before. She had been afraid for so long of losing things, of wanting things, of the cost of wanting and the cost of losing, and the particular cruelty of caring about something you couldn't protect. She had organized her life around the management of that fear, and she had called it practicality, and she had called it wisdom, and she had called it strength. And maybe it had been all of those things at one time or another. But she was sitting in a rented room looking at a wall, and the man in front of her had ridden a full day to find her, and a 5-year-old child had said, "Please, I need you to understand something," she said. He waited. "I'm not—" She stopped. Tried again. "I'm not easy. I don't mean that falsely modest. I mean that I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'm not good at deferring when I think I'm right, and I don't trust quickly, and there will be times when I pull back in ways that look like rejection, but aren't. I'm working on it." She looked at him. "I have done a lot of surviving. Surviving makes you— it creates habits that are not always useful when you're not in a survival situation. I don't always know when I'm not in one." He nodded. "All right. That's it? All right? What do you want me to say? That I want someone without any of that?" He almost smiled. "I'm a man who forgot to eat for 8 months and talks to his dead wife's chickens when I'm worried. We're both working on things." She looked at him. Something loosened in her, not all at once, not in any clean or complete way, just shifted. The way ground shifts when something that has been frozen begins to ease. "The town," she said. "I'll handle the town. You can't handle all of it." "No," he said, "but I can stand next to you while you handle your share. And you can stand next to me. That's what I'm proposing." She thought about what that looked like. 2 imperfect people standing next to each other in a community that had already decided what it thought. It was not a romantic picture. It was not an easy one. It was, she thought, the most honest proposal she had ever received. She stood up. Her legs worked this time. "I'll need to get my basket," she said. He looked at her for a moment to make sure he understood. "That's it?" "That's it," she said. "I'm not making a speech about it. I'm coming back. That's the answer." He picked up her basket from the floor near the door before she could reach it, and she let him, and they went down the stairs together, not touching, not quite, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her in the narrow stairwell, and out through the boarding house door into the cool October air. The horse he'd ridden was at the post out front. It was a big gray animal she'd seen before in the Rowan stable. Not pretty, but solid-looking. He tied her basket to the back of the saddle with the same practicality he brought to most physical things. No excess motion, and then he looked at her. "It's a long ride," he said. "You'll have to ride with me, unless you want to wait for the coach." "How long?" "Hours?" She looked at the horse. "I said I don't ride well." "You said that months ago. Hold on and lean into the turns." She put her foot in the stirrup, and he steadied her elbow, and she got up. And then he got up behind her, and they left Millhaven in the thin afternoon light with the mountains visible in the west, and the grassland rolling out in front of them, gold and brown and going on for miles. She did not lean comfortably against him for the first hour. Old habits. But the road was long, and the cold came down off the mountains as the afternoon moved toward evening, and by the time the lights of Red Ember Crossing appeared in the distance, she had stopped holding herself quite so separate. He didn't say anything about it. That was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He did not make events out of the things that didn't need to be made into events. He just rode, and she sat in front of him, and the horse moved through the dark with the steady patience of an animal that had been doing this its whole life. "She's going to cry when she sees you," he said, at some point in the last miles. "I know. Are you all right with that?" "No," Marigold said, "but I'll manage." She heard him exhale in a way that might have been a laugh, or might have been something quieter than that. They reached the ranch in full dark. The light was on in the kitchen window. Through the glass, from the gate, she could see the outline of Elsie sitting at the table, small and still and positioned in a way that said she had been sitting there a long time, and did not intend to move until she had reason. Garrick helped her down from the horse. She stood in the yard for a moment, looking at that window, and then she walked up to the house and opened the door. Elsie turned around. For a moment, neither of them moved. The girl's face went through several things at once: relief and fury and grief, and something so much like joy that it almost looked like pain. And then she was out of the chair and across the kitchen floor, and Marigold went down on one knee and caught her. Elsie held on with both arms and did not cry, which surprised her. She held on as hard as a small person could hold on and pressed her face against Marigold's shoulder and was very still. Then she said, into the fabric of Marigold's coat, "You came back." "I came back," Marigold said. "Are you staying?" Marigold held her tighter. She thought about fear and about weather and about the ground that stays the same underneath. She thought about walls and windows and the difference between looking out one and looking at one. She thought about what she had chosen and what she was choosing and what it would cost and what it was worth. "Yes," she said, "I'm staying." Elsie pulled back enough to look at her. Her eyes were dry, but her face was doing the thing it did when she was working very hard at something. "Promise?" Marigold looked at her. The kitchen was warm. The table was set for 3. Outside the window, she could hear Garrick seeing to the horse, the familiar sounds of the yard, the creak of the stable door, the soft noise of the animal settling. And in that ordinary, imperfect, completely specific moment, she made her decision all the way down. "I promise," she said. She kept the promise. That was not a small thing, and she did not pretend it was. Keeping it required work, the daily, unromantic kind of work that nobody writes about, because it doesn't have a shape that makes for a clean story. It required her to stay on mornings when she woke up with the old fear sitting on her chest like something with weight to it. It required her to sit at a table in a house that was not hers yet and eat breakfast with a man she was learning and a child she already loved, and to do it without flinching every time it felt too good to be sustainable. The night she came back, Garrick had made supper. It was not good supper. He had attempted a stew that was thinner than it should have been and had oversalted it in the way of a man cooking while worried about something else. But he had made it, and they ate it, all 3 of them at the table, and Elsie talked the entire meal without stopping. About Pearl, about the carrot bed, about a dream she'd had the night before that involved a river and a horse that could speak but chose not to, which she found philosophically interesting. She talked the way people talk when they've been holding their breath and can suddenly breathe again, too fast, covering ground, filling the air with the sound of herself as proof that she was still here and functioning. Marigold ate the thin, salty stew and said very little and watched Garrick watching his daughter and thought, this is what I almost walked away from, this particular, ordinary, irreplaceable thing. She did not let herself get sentimental about it. Getting sentimental was not, in her experience, the same as understanding something. She filed it away in the part of herself that was honest, and she kept eating. And when Elsie finally ran out of breath and looked at her plate and then back up and said, "Are you going to sleep here tonight?" she said, "Not tonight, but I'll be here in the morning." And Elsie accepted this with the same grave nod she gave to facts of nature. In the morning, she was there. And the morning after that, and the one after that. Garrick asked her to marry him on a Friday, which she had not expected. She had expected a Saturday, for no particular reason, just that Saturday felt like the day for significant things in that part of the territory. He asked her in the kitchen, which she also had not expected. She had imagined, in the private moments when she'd let herself imagine it at all, something with more scenery. But he came in from outside at mid-morning and stood in the kitchen doorway while she was cutting butter into flour and said, with the directness of a man who had been thinking about something long enough that the rehearsal had finally worn off, "I want to marry you. I should have said that when I found you in Millhaven instead of all the other things I said. I'm saying it now." She kept cutting the butter in. "Is that a question?" "Yes." She set down the pastry cutter. She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not casual, more like a man bracing for something, and his gray eyes were on her with the particular attention he brought to things that mattered to him. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That was quick." "I've been thinking about it for a while," she said, and turned back to the flour because the butter was at the right temperature and the moment was already more than she could carry and stand still at the same time. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the counter for a moment, just stood there, close. And then he said quietly, "All right then." and went back outside, and she heard the screen door and then his boots on the porch steps, and she stood at the counter and pressed the heels of her hands into the flour and breathed. Elsie appeared in the doorway 11 minutes later. She had clearly been listening from the hallway because her expression was the very specific one of a child who has information and is working out whether to pretend she doesn't. "Did he ask you?" she said. "Were you in the hall?" "A little bit." "Then you know whether he asked me." Elsie came fully into the kitchen and climbed up on her stool. "Are you happy?" Marigold thought about the question. A different woman might have said yes immediately and with feeling. A different woman might have cried, might have pulled the child into a hug and made it into a moment with shape and narrative. Marigold looked at the flour on her hands and the kitchen that had become, over these months, more herself than her own kitchen in town had ever managed to be. And she said, "Yeah, I think I am." "Good," Elsie said, "because I told Papa he should ask you 2 weeks ago." Marigold looked at her. "Did you?" He was being slow about it. He was being thoughtful. "Same thing sometimes," Elsie said with the authority of a child who had recently turned 6 and considered this a significant upgrade in perspective. They were married on a Saturday in November, which felt right. Not at the church. Marigold had not suggested it, and Garrick had not offered it, and neither of them had discussed why, but the absence of the suggestion felt like an agreement. They married in the yard of the ranch, which was cold and bright with the kind of winter light that turns everything high contrast, all edge and shadow, nothing softened. The judge from the county seat drove out because Garrick had written him a letter that apparently conveyed sufficient seriousness of purpose. Denny stood as witness, hands at his sides, dressed better than Marigold had ever seen him. Dora Finch came from town because Dora Finch did what she wanted. Red Ember Crossing came too. Not all of it, but enough. That was the thing Marigold had not predicted. Not that the community would accept her, but that some of them would show up anyway. Whether out of curiosity or something approaching an attempt at decency, she couldn't say. The Mercer sisters came. 2 of the men from the timbering operation who knew Garrick from land dealings. A woman named Luce who ran the laundry and had never said anything unkind to Marigold's face and had twice sent business her way without being asked. Reuben Alcott from the dry goods, without his wife. Vera Hollins was not there. Harriet Pryor was not there. Patrice Drummond was not there. But some people were, and that was not nothing. The ceremony itself was short and practical, in the way that court ceremonies tend to be, with no ornamentation and no music, just the words and the response, and the handshake between Garrick and the judge that meant it was real. Marigold wore the best dress she owned, which was a dark green wool she'd bought the previous winter and altered twice, and she stood in the cold yard and said yes when asked, and meant it all the way through, without qualification. Elsie stood beside her and held her hand. She had asked to do this 2 days before, formally, presenting the request at breakfast with the seriousness she brought to important things. "I want to stand next to you," she said. "Not next to Papa, next to you." And Marigold had said all right, and that had been that. And standing in the cold yard with Elsie's small hand in hers, saying yes to a life she had almost refused 3 times, she was aware of a fullness in her chest that she did not have a cleaner word for. Afterward, there was food. She had cooked most of it the day before with Elsie's help because some things didn't change regardless of the occasion. And the small gathering ate and talked, and the cold air turned people's cheeks red, and Denny drank 2 cups of the cider Garrick had brought up from the cellar and got slightly philosophical about land ownership in a way that was more interesting than it might have been at room temperature. Dora Finch cornered Marigold near the kitchen door as things were winding down. "You look better than you have in years," Dora said. "That's a low bar," Marigold said. "It's still a bar." Dora looked at her with the particular assessment of an old woman who has watched enough of other people's lives to know the difference between the varieties of happiness. "You're not scared right now." "I'm a little scared." "Of what?" Marigold looked at the yard. At Garrick talking to Reuben Alcott with his hand around a cup of cider. At Elsie chasing Pearl through the people's legs with a dedication that ignored the occasion entirely. "That it's real," she said. "That it's actually this." Dora made the sound that was her version of a nod. "It's this," she said. "Better get used to it." Marigold got used to it. Not quickly, and not without setbacks, which she would have told you to expect because nothing worth having comes arranged for convenience. There were mornings in the first month of winter when she woke up in the ranch house instead of her own house, and the unfamiliarity of the ceiling made something in her chest seize up before her brain caught up with where she was. There were evenings when she and Garrick disagreed, actually disagreed with sharpness, about the cattle operation and about money, and once about the kitchen garden in a way that started practical and became something larger before either of them realized it, and discovered that two people who have spent significant portions of their lives alone have deeply held opinions about how things should be done and do not abandon those opinions gracefully. The argument about the kitchen garden started because Garrick suggested they expand it, and Marigold said she'd think about it, and he took this as agreement and ordered the lumber for the new beds before she'd made a decision, and she found out about it from Denny, which was not the right way to find out about decisions that affected her work. She told him so. The kitchen, which was where they seemed to have all their significant conversations. She told him in a voice that was not heated. She had learned to keep it level, but that was precise about the specific problem. I need to be consulted on decisions about the things I'm responsible for. I don't mean asked after the fact. I mean before. He looked at her. He was not a man who apologized reflexively, which she'd come to appreciate because it meant that when he did apologize, it was because he'd actually thought about whether he'd done something wrong rather than just doing it to end the discomfort. He stood there for a moment and then said, "You're right. I should have asked." "The beds are a good idea," she said. "Okay. I just want to be part of making that decision." "Okay," he said again, and that was the end of it. And she recognized that this, the ability to say the thing and be heard and have it be enough, was something she had not had before and had not known how much she needed. They were not a perfect household. She would not have told you they were, and she would have distrusted anyone who claimed perfection about their own. They were a man and a woman who had both been broken in different ways by different losses, learning to occupy the same space without too much collision, which required constant and sometimes unglamorous navigation. But there was, underneath the navigation, underneath the disagreements and the mornings when the fear came back and the evenings when exhaustion made everyone shorter than they meant to be, a solidity to it, a sense that the thing had weight and structure, and that weight and structure would hold. Elsie held the most. That was the remarkable thing, in the end. Not what Marigold and Garrick built between them. That was something she'd had a hand in shaping, something she'd made choices about, something with her own labor woven through it. What she had not made and could not have planned for was Elsie Rowan herself, who seemed to have been put together from sturdier material than most people suspected when they looked at her. By midwinter, she was fully, undeniably herself again. Not the self she'd been before her mother died. That would have been a wrong kind of recovery, a papering over, but a self that had incorporated the loss and kept going. She talked about Clara without flinching now. She would say things like, "Mama used to do it this way," and then look at Marigold to see what she thought about this way, comparing and synthesizing rather than choosing between. She kept the lavender sachets in her pillowcase. She sat on the porch when it rained and counted the lightning, and in January she asked Marigold if she wanted to do it too, and Marigold sat beside her in the cold with a blanket over both of them, and they counted together. She still sang, constantly, in the kitchen, in the garden, in the yard, in ways that Pearl the chicken seemed to find objectionable based on the irritated sounds she made in response. The songs were all her own, made-up things with internal logic that didn't always hold, and melodies that wandered and sometimes didn't come back, which was exactly right for a 6-year-old composer who had bigger feelings than she had technical capacity and didn't yet care about the difference. Garrick came into the kitchen one Saturday morning in February to find Marigold and Elsie both at the counter, Elsie on her stool, Marigold beside her, making pancakes, which had become the Saturday ritual, the specific thing they did on the morning that was not a market morning and not a workday morning. He stood in the doorway in the way he sometimes did, watching without announcing himself, and Marigold knew he was there but let it be, because she had learned that these were the moments he stored up against the difficult ones, and she was not going to deny him that. Elsie was singing. Marigold was pouring batter. They were having an argument, cheerfully, about whether the batter was thick enough, Elsie insisting it wasn't, and Marigold insisting it was, both of them stating their positions with the confidence of people who felt safe enough to be wrong about something small. "It's too thin," Elsie said. "The edges will be weird." "The edges are supposed to be lacy. That's a feature." "It's not a feature. It's a mistake that you're calling a feature." That's how most features start out, Marigold said, and Elsie made a sound that was half argument and half laugh. Garrick poured himself coffee. He sat at the table. Elsie looked over her shoulder and said, "Tell her the batter's too thin, Papa." "I'm not getting involved in this," he said. "That's not a helpful answer." "It's the safest one." Elsie made the sound again and turned back to the bowl, and Marigold caught Garrick's eyes over her head, and he looked at her with an expression that was quiet and full at the same time, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment wasn't already saying. The pancakes came out fine. The edges were lacy. Elsie ate 4 of them and conceded nothing. Spring came early that year, or early-ish. The last frost broke in the first week of April, which by that territory's standards was practically optimistic. The kitchen garden went back in with the amendment she'd planned over winter. The beds now expanded by the lumber Garrick had ordered and a second round he'd ordered after asking this time. And the new arrangement gave her more room for the things she'd had ideas about. Pole beans along the back fence, 3 varieties of squash, a proper onion bed, and in a corner she'd claimed entirely for herself, a row of marigolds. Garrick had raised an eyebrow at those. "Practical," she said. "Flowers aren't practical. Marigolds keep certain pests off the vegetables. It's companion planting." She set the last seedling in. "Also, they're mine." He had not argued with this. What grew in the garden that spring was better than anything she'd managed on any patch of ground she'd ever tended, and she understood that this was partly the soil and partly the elevation and partly luck and partly just that it was easier to make things grow when you weren't spending all your energy making yourself stay. The ranch in general had a different quality by spring, not unrecognizably different. It was still the same land, the same structures, the same miles of fence that always needed something done to them, but the quality of it had shifted. The porch got repainted in April because Garrick and Denny did it on a dry week, and Elsie supervised in a way that was not always useful but was entirely consistent. The kitchen had curtains now, which Marigold had made over the winter from a bolt of yellow cotton that Dora Finch had left on their porch, with a note that said only, "For the kitchen. Don't argue." The stable had a new door on the 3rd stall, the old one having finally failed in a way that couldn't be argued with. And the cattle were better managed than they had been in 2 years, which had nothing to do with Marigold directly and everything to do with what happened to a man when he was sleeping and eating and not carrying grief alone. Garrick had made 2 decisions in the spring that a rancher without his head would not have made, a sale he'd been putting off that turned out to be timed well, a purchase of additional acreage from a neighbor moving east that expanded their operation more than anyone had expected. He was not, by his own assessment, transformed, but he was functional in ways he had not been, and functional had compounded. The town was not transformed either. She would not say it was. That would be the wrong kind of story. The kind where suffering produces a community lesson and everyone comes out educated and gracious. People are not like that, as a general rule. What actually happened was smaller and more specific. Some people shifted and some people didn't, and the ones who didn't would probably never shift, and that was simply the condition of living among other people rather than the wilderness. What changed was the proportion. Reuben Alcott started talking to her directly when she came into the dry goods store instead of through the transaction. The Mercer sisters invited her to their table at the market once, and she sat with them for 10 minutes, and it was unremarkable, which was its own kind of progress. Luce from the laundry brought a meal over in March when she heard Marigold had been sick for a week with a chest cold and left it on the porch with a note that didn't make a production of the gesture. These were not dramatic reconciliations. They were people behaving decently, one at a time, for their own reasons. Vera Hollins she saw once in April at the market, and they looked at each other across the square, and Vera's face did something complicated, and she nodded once in a way that was not an apology, but was perhaps the country adjacent to one. Marigold nodded back. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Not satisfying exactly, but sufficient. Some accounts didn't get settled, they just got closed. Patrice Drummond crossed the street to avoid her once in May, which was so specific and deliberate that Marigold told Garrick about it that evening, because it was genuinely almost funny, the commitment required to cross an entire muddy street rather than pass within 20 feet of someone. He did not find it as funny as she did, which was its own kind of love, the kind that cannot hear something unkind about you without wanting to do something about it, even when you don't want anything done. Leave it, she told him. She crossed the street. I saw. It was athletic. She put the supper plates on the table. I don't need you to fix it. I know. I just need you to be annoyed about it, which you already are, so we're done. He looked at her for a moment. You're not bothered. I didn't say that. She brought the bread over. I said leave it. Those are different things. I can be bothered and not need it fixed. He sat down. I don't always know the difference. I know, she said. That's what I'm here for. There were Saturdays they made pancakes, and there were Saturdays that were hard, and there were Sundays when the ranch was so quiet, and the mountains were doing something particular with the light, and Elsie was somewhere in the yard talking to Pearl with absolute seriousness. And in those moments, Marigold would sometimes stand at the kitchen window and feel the weight of everything she had almost not allowed herself to have, and it was not a comfortable feeling. It was more like gratitude that has edges to it, the kind that reminds you how close the other ending was. She thought about Thomas sometimes. Not with grief exactly, that had moved into something more like acknowledgement, the recognition that he had been a person and his death had mattered and his life had mattered, even if their time together had not been what either of them had needed. She thought about her son, who had lived 11 days, and who she had not let herself think about for years because the thinking had been too close to falling. She thought about him more gently now. She was not sure why the ranch had made that possible, whether it was Elsie or Garrick or the garden or simply the fact of not being alone anymore. But the thinking had become something she could sit with rather than something she had to outrun. There was a morning in late May when Elsie found her standing at the grave marker she'd made for herself, in the corner of the property behind the herb bed. Not a grave, but a small flat stone she'd placed with Thomas's name on it and the baby's, because she'd never had a place to put the thinking and she needed one. Elsie had come around the corner and stopped and looked at the stone and looked at Marigold. Who's buried there? She said. No one. It's a way to remember someone. Two someones, Elsie said. She was reading the names, working through them with the care of a child who reads well but deliberately. Thomas and... She sounded out the second name slowly. James. My husband and my son. She hadn't said it plainly to anyone before. He only lived a short time before I came here. Elsie looked at the stone. You lost a baby, she said. Yes. That's very sad. Yes. Elsie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Do you still miss them? Marigold thought about it honestly. I miss what they could have been, she said. That's the part that stays. Elsie nodded slowly. She crouched down and pulled a weed from the ground next to the stone with the matter-of-fact practicality she brought to most physical problems. I could bring flowers sometimes, she said, if you wanted. From the marigold row. Marigold looked at her. They're your flowers, Elsie said. It makes sense. She had to look away. She looked at the herb bed and the mountains and the pale late May sky, and she breathed through it until she could speak. That would be very nice, she said. Elsie nodded, satisfied, and brushed the dirt off her hands and went back to whatever she'd been doing before, because she was 6 years old and the world was full of things that needed attending to, and she had deposited her comfort and could move on to the next task. That was the thing about Elsie. She didn't hold on to her kindnesses in a way that required acknowledgement. She just offered them and went. Marigold thought, not for the first time, that this child would be formidable when she grew up, and hoped she'd be around to see it. The summer brought the fullest kitchen garden she'd ever had a hand in. It brought long evenings on the porch, and Garrick's quiet and Elsie's constant commentary on the natural world and the particular rhythm of a working ranch in the good season, which was relentless but had a quality of purpose to it that exhaustion in an empty house never did. It brought the Mercer sisters asking Marigold for her pie recipe, which she gave because keeping recipes was a kind of hoarding she didn't believe in. It brought a Saturday in July when she went to the market and set her pies on the table at the corner near the livery smell, and Reuben Alcott came over and bought 2 before she'd finished setting up. And then the woman behind him, a young woman she didn't recognize, new to the area, looking uncertain about where to go, asked which pie she'd recommend. And Marigold said the blueberry, and the woman bought it and said, I heard you make the best pies in the crossing. And Marigold said, I don't know who said that. And the woman said, a few people, and moved on. She stood at her table for a moment after that. Just a moment. Then she straightened the cloth and waited for the next customer. In August, she discovered she was pregnant. She lay in the dark of the ranch house and looked at the ceiling. A ceiling she now knew the way she knew her own hands, every particular and imperfection of it, and thought about what she felt. Not about what she was supposed to feel, what she actually felt. Terrified. Obviously. There was no arrangement of events in her history that would allow her to feel otherwise. And under the terror, something else. Something that she had not felt the first time with Thomas, because the first time she had been 20 years old and alone and afraid in ways that left no room for anything else. Something that was, she worked to find the word and found it and let herself use it, even in the silence of her own head, even in the dark, glad. She was glad. She told Garrick in the morning after Elsie had gone out to the garden. She told him standing at the counter with her coffee, which seemed right. She had a pattern of telling him important things at the counter with her coffee, and she saw no reason to deviate. He stood there for a moment. His face did the thing it did when he felt something large and was sorting out what to do about it. Are you all right? He said. Scared, she said. Me too. I know. She set her cup down. But I think it's going to be all right. You don't know that, he said gently. No, but I think it. She looked at him. That's enough for right now. He crossed the kitchen and pulled her against him with the same directness he brought to everything, and she let herself be held, which she was still getting used to. The ability to be held without needing to calculate whether she could afford it. They told Elsie at lunch. She received the information with the gravity it warranted, processing it through several expressions in sequence. And then she said, "Is it going to take my room?" "No," Garrick said. "It'll have the small room." "The room with the blue curtains?" "We'll put in whatever curtains it wants." Elsie considered this. "It won't have opinions yet. It's a baby." She picked up her fork. "I'll choose the curtains. I have good taste." Marigold looked at her plate. "You chose orange," she said. "Orange is bold. There's a difference between bad taste and bold taste." "That's actually a good distinction," Garrick said. "I know." Elsie ate her lunch with the serenity of someone who has settled the matter. What Marigold thought about later was not the baby, or the curtains, or even the morning's conversation. She thought about a square in Red Ember Crossing and a little girl sitting in the dirt beside a wagon wheel with a cold piece of cornbread in her lap. She thought about the specific courage required to hold out your hand to someone who has no reason to take what you're offering, and the specific courage required, on the other side, to take it. She thought about all the ways she had been afraid, and all the ways she had been small about herself, and all the ways the fear had been reasonable and had still cost her things she couldn't afford to lose. She thought about what it actually meant to stay. Not romantically, not as an act of love with music under it, but practically. To show up in the morning and do the work and come back the next morning and do it again. And to keep doing this not because you were certain of the outcome, but because the alternative, which you had tried, was a room with a view of another building's wall. She had learned, was still learning, would probably spend most of her life in the process of learning, that courage was not the absence of fear. She'd heard that said before, and it had always seemed too simple, the kind of thing you put on a sampler. What she understood now from the inside of it was that the fear didn't go away. The fear was just outvoted by everything else you wanted, by the people you didn't want to leave, by the person you were, underneath the armor you'd built, who needed things the armor kept out. She was still afraid most mornings. She still had the habit of calculating exits, of keeping one foot on the side of self-sufficiency, of bracing for loss with the reflex of someone who had lost enough to develop good reflexes. She probably always would. Some things weren't healed, they were just accommodated. But she had stayed. She was staying. That fall, Elsie started school in Red Ember Crossing, which required riding in with Garrick on Mondays and Wednesdays and coming back in the evenings. And the teacher, a young woman new to the territory who apparently had not received the full briefing on the Rowan Ashcroft social situation, told Garrick at the end of the first week that Elsie was the most confident reader in the class and also the most opinionated, which was not always the same as the most accurate, but was never boring. Garrick told Marigold this at supper, and Marigold said, without looking up from her plate, "She gets it from somewhere." "Not from me," he said. "No," she agreed. Elsie looked between them. "I'm right here," she said. "We know," they said, at the same time. And it was not coordinated or planned. It was just the thing that was true. The marigolds in the corner of the garden came back the following spring on their own, which Marigold had not expected because she'd not been certain they were hardy enough to overwinter. She found them on a morning in April when she went out to begin the season's planting, small and orange and entirely themselves in the early light, and she stood there looking at them for longer than was strictly practical. She had been a widow in a bad corner of the market with pies no one wanted to buy. She had been the woman everyone looked at and looked away from, the woman with the mark of misfortune on her that the town had decided was a matter of character. She had also been the woman who held out her hand. That mattered. She had decided it mattered, and she intended to keep deciding it, every morning, for as long as she could manage. Elsie came out in her boots and her coat with a cup of something warm for her, tea, which Elsie was just beginning to drink with the seriousness of a convert, and stood beside her looking at the marigolds. "They came back," Elsie said. "They did. I thought they might." She handed over the cup. "I checked on them all winter. The roots looked okay under the mulch." Marigold looked at her. She had not known Elsie was doing this. She had not asked her to. The child had just done it, quietly, out of the view of anyone who might have called it remarkable. "Thank you," Marigold said. Elsie shrugged with the particular dignity of someone who does not require thanks for things they do because they care about them. She drank her tea. The morning light came across the garden, and the mountains to the west were still wearing their last snow on the high peaks. And from the kitchen behind them came the smell of bread that Garrick had put in the oven at 6, because he had learned, finally, how to time it right. She stood in her garden with her daughter beside her and the bread coming warm through the air, and she thought, this is the thing. Not the happiness, which came and went like any weather. Not the absence of fear, which she had stopped waiting for. This, the returning of things you didn't know you'd planted. The company of people who checked on your roots in winter and don't tell you about it. The ordinary, unremarkable morning that holds everything you almost refused. This was the thing. She drank her tea. She went back to work.